I'm Jim Fox. I'm the product manager for Remote for AWS, and I'm joined by Rio Koyama. He's our CEO and one of the founders of remote.it. And we also have our resident AWS expert, Robert Ford, with us. We'll be your hosts for the presentation. Topics for today. We want to give you a little background on the company, why we built this product, and what we see happening in the market. And then we'll get right into the product. What is remote for AWS? How is it different than other products you may have tried or used before? I'll do some demonstrations of remote for AWS, and then we'll take questions at the end in a panel format. So let's start out who and what is remote. I'm going to ask our CEO, Rio, to speak to that. So Rio, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Jim. So just a little background for everybody on the company itself. The founders, we really know TCP/IP, so we might not always be the smartest guys in the world, but we do understand the protocol pretty well. And in fact, a few of us actually wrote and implemented the first version of TCP/IP in Silicon. And that company was actually bought by NVIDIA, and a number of the folks that were involved in that are still kind of at the core of kind of their data center stuff that's going on. And then a little bit of background just on remote.it itself. We're actually widely used for enterprise. SoftBank's carrier group in Japan actually resells our solution. And currently we're used in 194 different countries. And some of the examples include we're used at many of the top EV charging stations in North America. One of the largest manufacturers of base station uses us to deploy LTE and 5G base stations. Many users in the healthcare, construction, and point of sale markets. So often it's used for different devices, especially if they go out into the field and are on premise in a different kind of location where maybe they don't have IT staff or don't have the ability to get access to those things because of configuration. So in terms of, why would you want to use remote.it? Sort of our view of the world is that other than your public website, there's really no reason to have open ports on the internet. Also, if you think about open ports, what ends up happening are using things like IP whitelists to manage access. But that doesn't necessarily prevent scanning. And it's getting much worse because of all the distributed work that's happening. More and more, we're hearing that extended workforces are requiring a lot of different IP addresses, sort of making the IP whitelist unmanageable. And at the same time, if you have mobile connections, now all of a sudden the IP address is actually the carrier's IP address. And so it exposes a hole that sometimes people haven't necessarily even thought about. And in terms of how remote.it itself works, and you'll see this in kind of Jim's examples, we work through the local host addresses. So these are usually private addresses. So just if you're working on the machine, but you could be on an iPhone connected to your AWS instance, and your iPhone will be communicating through a 127 address. And so it ensures that you have absolute privacy because it's an address that only you can see, and that's not routable across the internet. So just one last slide to talk a little bit about how we ended up here. As I've talked about, we work with a lot of companies on end devices, often referred to as IoT devices. But what ended up happening is that a number of our point of sale customers were saying, hey, we really love remote.it. It helps us provide protection by having no open ports. And so the devices are not scannable on premise. But we'd like to make sure that the end-to-end connections are also protected. And so a number of them asked us to make that available so they could protect their cloud assets. And then once we did that project, we realized, oh, wow, this is something that really makes a lot of sense for a lot of folks. And so we decided to make that into a standard product that we make available. And that's what we'll cover here today. All right, Jim, it's up to you.
All right, thanks, Rio. So let's get into the product. What is remote.it for AWS? Well, in simplest terms, remote.it is a marketplace application that gives customers a better way to make connections to their AWS environment. And what makes remote.it really different is the connections to AWS do not rely on open ports at a public IP, which also means we can eliminate the practice of IP whitelisting as a way of securing open ports. And as many of you know, every open port increases your cloud's attack surface. So the best practice today is to just close all open ports at AWS to the point where the only open port you should ever really need is for your public website. And with no open ports, you no longer have to maintain IP whitelist, which is a big plus. So at a high level, remote.it is a dedicated EC2 instance that you'll launch into your AWS environment. And it works with our desktop apps to make direct connections to just about any resource you'll have in your AWS environment. If a resource uses an IP address and a port to communicate with the outside world or with other resources, then you can bring that out to your desktop and manage it. We also allow you to manage user access to any resource within AWS. So you can think of this remote.it instance as a gateway to your AWS cloud. It's essentially bringing AWS resources out to your desktop, again, without relying on open ports or IP whitelists. And that's, I think, a key difference between remote.it versus a typical Bastion host or jump host you may have heard of, or even a VPN. So let's talk about this open port risk. Whenever you have an open port on a public IP, it's of course scannable, meaning discoverable from the internet. So it's therefore vulnerable to attack. And there's really no way around that. Even a VPN server will present an open port to the public internet and therefore vulnerable to attack. And we see the list of VPN hacks growing all the time. But with remote.it over here on the right, you really can close all your open ports and maintain connectivity to the resources you need inside AWS. So in that way, cloud resources are really hidden from the public internet, which is a big plus in today's security environment. IP whitelisting, let's talk about that for a minute. Of course, IP whitelisting is a security measure to restrict access to open ports on public IP addresses. But we've seen happening, and what we hear over and over again from customers is that in the age of distributed workforce and remote work, it's just becoming very challenging to maintain these lists because we have distributed workforces, developers, contractors, IT staff, DevOps people, all spread out in different locations. And each IP address represents, of course, one location for one individual connecting, generally if they're roaming. So over time, this can just grow to be out of control. And instead of providing security, it actually becomes more of a liability as the list grows and grows. And you'll need a list for every open port that you want to protect in this manner. So you can see the problem with that over time. With remote.it, you can eliminate this practice completely because there are no open ports to protect in this manner. Remote.it access is granted using an email-based authentication system. You can use your Gmail login to grant access to users as well. So it's identity-based rather than location-based. We like to say remote.it authentication is based on your ID, not on IP or location. So that's a big advantage as well. I think this is probably one of the most popular features or benefits of remote.it. One of our first customers really needed that, and that was their main motivation for going with remote.it for their AWS. The other benefit I'd like to talk about is what we call service level isolation, meaning users are granted access to AWS resources at the service level or port level. So once I have a remote.it instance launched inside AWS in my environment, let's say I have a machine that has multiple services presented to the network here. I might have an internal web app, maybe command line for administrator. I could have databases, MySQL or whatever you're using, generic TCP. Remote.it can make these connections on behalf of users. But let's say we have a user out here who only needs access maybe to one service on that instance, and they don't need access to these other services. Well, with remote.it, you can grant this user access only to the service, only on the instances they need. So you have a much finer resolution of control on what users get access to what resources. And that's unlike VPN or maybe Bastion host that would protect network segments, but not necessarily to the resource, or rather to the service level. Same with the Bastion host, right? That will expose entire resources rather than individual services. So a lot of customers find that very useful in their user management. In this case, this user only granted access to one port. Well, let's go ahead and jump into some demonstrations. This will give you a feeling for how it works. We talked about you can close your open ports. So I'd like to show you what that really looks like. I'm going to ask everyone to participate here in this demo. So if you're watching, go ahead and open a browser, and you can point that at this public IP address. And we're going to put that in the chat, that IP address. But that address is a public website at AWS. In remote, it's a demo environment. And it's a simple web page. Looks like this image you're seeing on the screen. But if you point your browser there, you'll see that web page will just display the public IP address of where you're connecting from, and reflect that back to your display here with a timestamp. So go ahead and give that a try. Of course, you're able to connect because the ports are open. The web ports 80 and 443 are open. So let's take a look at that. You can see that I can connect. I see a lot of people have been connecting. And if I refresh, that's my connection here, and you see the timestamp. So very good. Let's go back. And we can all connect because those ports are open, of course. Now I want to, let me go to my other window here. These are all my instances. This is a demo account inside our AWS environment. We use this for demos and prototyping. You'll see we have a few instances running here, but I'm going to connect to that web server that we just looked at. And if we look at the security groups, you'll see that you're able to connect because we've opened the ports 80 and 443. So that's now publicly accessible. But if I want to close those, I can go here to the security group settings. I'll just remove that rule or remove that security group that opens up those ports, save it. And now, if you're trying to connect, I'll do that again here, rather right here. If you're trying to refresh your screen or connect, you won't be able to because, of course, we've closed those ports. So this will just spin and spin. It won't be able to connect. So we've made those ports undiscoverable on the internet, which is the best security posture you can have, right? So I've closed those ports. They're not discoverable. They're not scannable on the internet. Now I'm going to show you how we can use remote.it to connect, even though those ports are closed. So I have a remote.it instance launched in this AWS environment. We've set up connections to that website, and I'm going to use my remote.it desktop app to go ahead and show you how that looks. So let's switch over here. I'll just log into my remote.it account. And this is on my local machine using my desktop app. And when I log in, the first thing I see is the remote.it for AWS instance in my account. This is in our demo account. If I click into that, I see all the services or all the connections available that we've pre-configured. So these were set up earlier. But this is the one I'm interested in, the website demo we just looked at. So all I do is click connect, and remote.it will give me an IP and a port that I can then launch into a browser. And as you can see, I'm able to connect. And that first entry here is the private IP or local IP of the remoted instance up at AWS. So I'm able to make connections through that instance to this website, even though we've completely closed those ports off. So if you have a private web app, for example, you don't need to open that to the public internet. I also want to show you what it looks like to configure a connection for remoted at AWS. So what I mean is, how do we set up our instance to reach any individual instance, any service we want to get to? Well, first thing we'll do is select a target resource. I'm going to select this Windows instance on a private subnet inside our AWS environment. And I'm going to go show you what that looks like. Here we are. So it's this instance right here. This is a Windows instance inside our demo environment. And you see it has no public IP address whatsoever. It's in a private subnet. It does have a private IP. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to need that in a moment. Let's go back here. So I've selected that as my target resource. I'm going to select a service on that resource. So I'm going to choose RDP port 3389 as the connection I'd like to make. And the way I'm going to set that up is from my desktop, I'm going to connect to the remoted instance and access the admin panel on the remoted instance. And it's in this admin panel that we can configure connections to any other resource, any other instance and port inside our AWS environment. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, I'm just going to go back to my remoted desktop right here. And I want to connect to that admin panel up at AWS. So that's this one here. And we have a lot of services we've set up in advance, but this is the one we need right now. So I'm going to launch that. And right now we're connecting to the AWS instance. And now I'm on that instance. This is a little website that's hosted there. And if I click into that, I can see all the services we've set up. So each of these was configured to make a connection for us inside AWS. If I want to add one, I just click Edit, Add. We'll choose RDP to get to the Windows machine. I'm going to paste that IP address I copied earlier. That's the private IP address of the Windows instance at AWS. And that's it. I'll just save it. Once that comes online, see it appeared there. Once that comes online, I'll just refresh. You see it's gone green. So that's it. I configured that connection very quickly. I did not have to change any security group settings. I didn't have to change any VPN settings, no IP whitelisting, just very simple. A couple minutes to set that up. And now I can connect. What I'm going to do is use an RDP client to make a connection from my desktop all the way to that Windows instance in the private subnet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll go back to the remoted desktop. If I refresh this, I'll see that connection appear that I just configured. So I'll go ahead and say connect. And just copy that. Remote.it always gives me an IP and a port. And these are persistent. You can bookmark them. And now I'm in, remember I'm here. I got my IP and port, so I'm going to start an RDP client and make that final connection. This is my Microsoft RDP client, so I'm just going to put that remote generated IP and port in there. add that. And again, that port and IP is persistent, so I can leave it here, bookmarked here, and use it as I wish. Just put in my Windows credentials, and I'll be able to make that final connection. We didn't put a root certificate on there, so you always get that message, and then there you have it. So very easily, quickly, again, without changing any security groups or IP whitelist, VPN settings, and so forth, I was able to connect to a private resource in a private subnet at AWS. So that's the idea, to give you access to any resource inside your VPC from your desktop without the complexity of a lot of other solutions out there. Let me show you one more demo here. Service level isolation we talked about, meaning if I have an instance at AWS that has multiple services, I can grant access to all of those or individual services as I please. So if I have this user A, maybe that's an admin, needs access to all services. User B, maybe just one service. So we can do that with remote.it. We're going to use what's called the sharing feature. Some of you might be familiar with that. But to grant access to individual services, we'll use sharing. And there's two types of sharing with remote.it. There's individual device and service sharing, and also entire deviceless sharing. This is a newer feature you may not have seen before, but I'll show you how those work. All we do is go to the remote.it desktop app, click the sharing icon, and we can choose what services we want to make available to other users. So for example, I'm here on the AWS instance. If I click into that, I can say share. And then it gives me a choice, every individual connection type or service we've set up. So here's the one I just did. I just enter an email address, and I can share that to anyone who has a remote.it account through their email address. I could also share everything, of course, but in this case, I just want to share one individual service. Now, if I want to make the entire device list and everything available to multiple users, I can go to this settings tab, click device list sharing, and the same principle applies here. I can add a user's email, and they'll then have access to every service, every device in my device list. So that's a very convenient way to enable other users for full access rather than doing one at a time.
Hey, Jim, I think it's important here to assist that if you use device list sharing, also any future devices in your list will be shared also.
Yeah, that's right. As we add new connections, new services, those will automatically be shared with all the recipients of the device list sharing. So that's a very nice feature as well. Finally, I think one thing a lot of users really like is just having a single interface on your desktop to make all your connections. So on the left here, you'll see I have a list of every connection I've configured. I have a pull down menu on my taskbar up here. Every single connection, I can just launch it or copy the IP and port to my clipboard and use it in the appropriate client. So it's just a very convenient, easy way to launch your connections into AWS. Again, those IP and ports are persistent, so you can bookmark them, which makes it very easy to use. And there's also an auto launch feature. So you may have seen me use that. I auto launch some browsers with that arrow button. Of course, you can launch the appropriate client, whether it be RDP, database, tool, and so forth. So just to summarize, remote.it for AWS is there to eliminate open ports in your cloud environment, thereby making it a lot more secure, undiscoverable, unscannable from the internet. That will eliminate the practice of IP whitelisting to secure open ports as well, because without open ports, you won't need to whitelist in that way. Identity-based access, we talked about. It's not using whitelist, it's using a email authentication, an OAuth compatible system. You can use your Gmail to log in as well and grant individual users their account access. Also, service level isolation we just saw. So if you have multiple services on an instance, you're able to share individual services based on the user's requirements. So how would you get started? Well, before you begin, make sure you have a remoted account, AWS account, and you've got the right remoted desktop app for your local machine. These are available on our website at the downloads page. You go to the AWS Marketplace, look for remote.it in the search, and you can set that up in probably 10 minutes or less. It'll guide you right through that. There's a Terraform module already set up you can use as a reference for launching the AMIs. Resources, we have full written documentation you can follow as far as how to launch your remote for AWS instance into your cloud. And there's also a YouTube video that takes you through it step by step. And these links we'll be putting in the chat, so you'll have those. So we really encourage everyone to give it a try. It's available under a free trial license right now in the marketplace, and we will support you fully on that. We're offering guided one-on-one setup, meaning we'll get on a Zoom call with you and you can walk through with our experts a setup, make your first connection. Again, it's offered under a free trial license to do all that. We've even made a Calendly link here, which will let you schedule time with us to do a setup, a guided setup. And you can always email me directly, Jim at remote.it, if you'd like to set this up or just have a question. So I really encourage you to give it a try. There's no obligation, of course, but we think you'll like it once you get it set up, and we're happy to help you do that. I'll quickly cover the licensing and pricing. This is our pricing page. It's on the remote AWS Marketplace page. But for less than $1 a month, starting at less than $1 a month per service, if you buy the 12-month plan, you can protect ports up to 5 services like we saw, web, SSH. The RDP connection I added, that would be considered one service when I added that one connection to the Windows instance. And for more services, you see the pricing scale here. Pricing is based on the number of services, not the number of instances, so there's no charge for additional AMIs. Again, it's offered initially under the BYOL license at AWS, so you can give it a try, free trial, and after that you have the option, of course, to convert to a paid subscription after the free trial. So with that, let me open it up to Q&A. I'm going to ask the panel here to come off mute and help me answer some questions.
All right, just as a reminder, if you do have questions, please go to the bottom of your screen and use the Q&A button as outlined on the screen to type in your questions, and we'll be happy to address them. First question, can you explain the difference between remote.it and VPN, and will it work with my VPN?
Yes, that's a good question we get a lot. Remote.it can coexist with a VPN, meaning you can run your VPN connection over remote.it. And the reason you'd want to do that is to hide the open port that a VPN server typically needs. You can use remote.it without a VPN, but you can also run your VPN connection over remote.it and thereby eliminate that vulnerability of an open port. So that's why we see customers doing that.
Next question is, if I'm a current remote.it user, how does this relate to existing licensing with my device-based subscription?
Yeah, this plan is going to be offered separately from the what we call the IoT plans and products. If you're already using remote.it to connect to, say, a fleet of embedded systems out there at your customer sites, this would be a different licensing model through the marketplace. It'll be charged directly to your AWS marketplace invoice every month, and it will show up there. So it's separate than the IoT plans we offer on our website.
Next question is also pricing related. The example or question is around an example. If I have 5 servers with 3 services exposed to remote.it, what pricing plan would I require?
Well, if you have 5 instances of remote.it for AWS and 3 services or 3 available connections on each one, then that would represent 15 services. So you would go with the 25 services plan. So you can have as many AMI as you need. Those don't incur additional charges. The pricing is based purely on the number of services or the number of available connections that you've set up in your account.
Does that mean we must purchase the EC2 instances through remote.it?
Well, when you launch an AMI, a remote.it AMI in AWS, it will launch a T2 Micro. It's a free tier eligible small instance where the remote.it instance will run. You will have to pay for that unless you're free tier eligible based on your other usage. But that will be billed through your AWS account and not through remote.it or the remote.it add-on for AWS.
A related second part of that same question, is there any reason we can't install remote.it on our existing EC2 instances?
Yes, that's a good question. We are working on an installer rather than launch a dedicated AMI, an installer you can use just to launch it on a instance you already operate. So that is something we will be offering.
All right, Jim, can you provide us with contact details should someone want to connect with us?
These would be the best contact resources. So support at remote.it. Our support team is very quick and will respond back to you quickly. You can always email me directly, Jim at remote.it, and we've set up this link at Calendly to let you schedule your own one-on-one session with us. So please take advantage of that. We encourage everyone to try it, and we'll be happy to work with you to set up your first connection there. These are our resources you may have seen before. I'd like to point out our YouTube channel is a great resource. There's a lot of information there. This webinar will be there. Also, the step-by-step instructions, how to set up remote for AWS is already there. You can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn. Of course, the downloads page is where you would get your desktop app. So with that, I want to thank you for attending and encourage you to give it a try. We're here to help, so don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much.